Welcome, class, to our first video lecture for the Public Health Class 502, Environmental Determinants of Public Health. We're going to begin this lecture with a discussion of the public health and the environment beginning in the late 1700s and early 1800s and continuing up to Louis Pasteur. So let's begin in Philadelphia in 1806. As you all know, Philadelphia is built along the Delaware River, and the Delaware River and the Schuylkill River have marshes, wetlands, and are a wonderful breeding ground for mosquitoes. The mosquitoes transmitted yellow fever, and Philadelphia was subject to a number of yellow fever outbreaks. In 1806, this man, Thomas Paine, who many of you recognize as the intellectual voice of the American Revolution, got interested in the transmission of yellow fever. At the time, no one knew that mosquitoes were the vector. At the time, no one even knew that yellow fever was a communicable disease. All they knew was that it seemed to originate at the waterfront and spread inland. There was, of course, a Board of Public Health in Philadelphia at this time, as there were in many other larger cities. Thomas Paine subscribed to the prevailing idea at the time that there was no such thing as pathogenic bacteria. That idea was still forming in the minds of biologists and physicians. The idea at the time was that bad air, or malaria if you prefer, was the actual disease-causing agent. It was the odors coming off of the river and not the mosquitoes that were transmitting yellow fever. Now, at the time, most of the docks in Philadelphia were solid. That was, you built a cribbing out into the river and you filled it so that there were little coves in between the piers where foul water, untreated sewage, garbage, and other unpleasant things that would decay and start to stink would accumulate. So what Thomas Paine proposed to do was to build wharves that would allow the tides to come in, circulate, flush out the garbage and the untreated sewage and the muck, and remove the sources of bad air, and thus prevent the spread of yellow fever. Now, although Thomas Paine was wrong about the way that yellow fever was spread, nonetheless, he is the first major intellectual to be thinking about the relationship between the built environment, the natural environment, and public health. I think most of you are also familiar with this gentleman in London, Dr. John Snow. He was active in the 1840s trying to trace the origins of cholera. Now, cholera is, of course, transmitted through the waste products of infected people that find their way into the water supply and infect other persons. And Dr. John Snow worked in London in an area around Broad Street. And if you notice on this map of London in the 1840s, all of the pumps, the public water supply pumps, if you didn't have water in your house, you actually took a bucket or a container out onto the street to the nearest public pump your drinking water into a bucket and carried it back into your house or apartment. And what Dr. John Snow noticed was that by plotting all of the cholera cases, they all seemed to surround the public pump on Broad Street. And he was able, for the first time, to show how a communicable disease was transmitted through contaminated water. Now, of course, at this time, people had known for centuries that there was a link between pure water and good health. But until Dr. Snow came along, no one could prove it. This was the first scientific proof that clean water and good health went together. It was during this time that the Croton Aqueduct in New York City was being constructed. New York City, which at that time consisted just of the lower part of Manhattan Island, was taking its water from a place called the Collect Pond. And the Collect Pond, unfortunately, was collecting animal waste, was collecting human waste, was collecting garbage, was collecting litter, and it was so contaminated that horses, being smarter than people, often refused to drink out of. So to give New York City a source of clean drinking water, the Croton Aqueduct was constructed from southern New York State all the way down into New York City with a reservoir at what is today Bryant Park and the site of the New York Public Library. But what really got people thinking about public health in the United States was the Civil War. And this is a picture of the Brooklyn Sanitary Fair of 1864. This is not New York City's first theme restaurant, but this is a drawing of upper-class ladies dressed in colonial garb. Here they are spinning. Here they are cooking over an open fire, serving meals to paying customers. As I say, it was kind of a theme restaurant fundraiser. But what were they raising money for? They were raising money for the U.S. Sanitary Commission. During the American Civil War, the number of men enlisted in the Confederate Army has been estimated somewhere between 750,000 and 1.3 million. In the Union Army, 2.7 million men were enlisted, and many of these men were away from home for the first time. They had no idea about sanitation. They had no immunity to common communicable diseases, and a great many men, particularly from rural areas, died in camp or suffered from dysentery. The Army establishment was completely unprepared for having this many men under arms. And so to compensate for the lack of sanitation, for the lack of good food, for the lack of proper attention to camp discipline and sanitation, two organizations emerged in the Union States, the Christian Commission and the U.S. Sanitary Commission. Sanitary Commission inspectors patrolled the camps, insisting that they be cleaned up, insisting that the latrines and the drinking water supplies were not next to each other, insisting that very common, very basic public health measures were put in place. It is important to remember at this time that no one had an idea of germ theory. People didn't really know what caused disease. They did, however, know that poor sanitation helped spread disease. A number of scientists, a number of bacteriologists, a number of doctors were working on the idea of pathogens and a germ theory, but this was not accepted during the Civil War. Here is a photograph of a Union soldier's hut in camp. This is the quarters that the men lived in during the winter. Because of the poor transportation, the armies really didn't fight during the winter. They stayed in camp, they rested, they regrouped, they trained, and they would begin their campaigns again in the spring. You can see that this camp is fairly clean. Here is some litter on the ground. There's a man with an axe chopping firewood to keep the hut warm. And, of course, there's a man with a broom sweeping the ground in front of the hut. It looks like what's here is a clothesline for drying laundry. There seems to be a pile of something here. Maybe it's coal, maybe it's some sort of garbage or debris. But you see that the men are all clean. They're all wearing clean uniforms. They are paying attention to camp sanitation. Think about this. 2.7 million men in the Union Army were forced to live in Army camps. They were exposed to the idea of sanitation and public health for the first time. They were exposed to the idea of living together, cooperating on keeping the built environment clean. And when these men would return to civilian life, they would carry these ideas back into civilian life. Now along came this gentleman, French Dr. Louis Pasteur, who in 1878 published a book, Germ Theory and its relation to medicine and surgery. Now, as I said before, people had been thinking about germ theory. People had been working on germ theory much earlier. There were lots of hints that there were such a things as pathogenic bacteria. But it wasn't until this guy came along and consolidated the thinking and published it in a textbook that set out germ theory clearly, succinctly, and convinced the medical establishment that germs, that pathogenic bacteria, were the cause of disease, not the foul air, as was thought during Thomas Paine's time, not the smell of waste products, but rather the disease or the pathogens that bred in these waste products were the cause of disease. And once Louis Pasteur organized the thinking on the subject and published his book on germ theory, the foundations of modern public health were laid. Now we'll continue with this in a moment.